Good to see everybody here for another GRIP-Birkman Coaches Cafe, as we're going to have a conversation talking about the allure of structure with John Blake. John is our team leader for the GRIP-Birkman team and president of an organization called I to We, and also change management consultant. But John, the name changed, and I have trouble catching up with the change of name from change management consultant at Providence Health Systems. What is the official title of it now?
Organizational transformation. Doesn't it sound impressive?
Oh, you're the OT guy, not the
That's
IT guy. Okay, organizational transformation.
Don't get those two mixed up. Can't really help you out with the other one. Got nothing for you.
Right. Oh, yeah, there you go. So I want to jump right into the conversation, but first I'm going to ask Matt Blake over in Europe right now. You've got a great signal, and I think you've got good audio. Matt, would you lead us in a word of prayer to get us started?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Lord, we are grateful for this day. We're thankful for the gift of some time together to listen, to learn, to think together for the sake of the call that you've put on our lives to be about your ministry and your kingdom. And we desire, Lord, that you would be honored in this hour that we have together, but also, Lord, that you would be so pleased as to help us, guide us by your Spirit. Lord, would you give us insight and understanding? And we just thank you, Lord, again for the way that you lead us, and that you, as our shepherd, we can be so happy to be your sheep, following along under your lead. Thanks that we can do that together in this time today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. John, you titled the article, The Allure of Structure. Help us a little bit define, what do you mean by the allure of structure?
Well, I thought about the seduction of structure, and it just seemed like that was going too far down that road, so I just went with the allure. It's that we, a lot of times in uncertainty, we try to hold on to constructs that aren't always helpful as we're trying to navigate into a new season. We try to look at structure in a false light, and so the allure of it is that it gives us this false sense that we have control. It gives us a false sense that we can hold on to things in a certain way, and frankly, in change and in times of transformation, that's not always helpful. And especially as it pertains to I to we and body life, the temptation to find what is comfortable to us can oftentimes override what is truly important as far as us being open-handed and releasing to be able to make the transformation that we need to.
So when we're thinking about the uncertainty that tends to move us toward structural changes, and how does the uncertainty move us more toward that, and even I guess I would say even to look at the structure as being the solution to the problem? How does uncertainty really contribute to that?
I think uncertainty, whether that be, hey, we're not performing the way that we wanted to, or hey, we've had some turnover that we weren't expecting, or we've set a new strategy, and frankly, the way that we're set up, it isn't going to go there. That those uncertainties, just like in GRIP-Birkman language, anytime that we experience stress, what is stress ultimately going to do? It's going to cause us to become inward focused, and that is really at the core of a lot of this, that when we become inward focused, then we try to hold on very tightly to those things that that we don't want to see change, right? We talk about resistance being a function of disruption. This idea of you know, whether it's good or it's bad, the disruption will cause us to resist. Well, a lot of times resistance will look like I'm trying to grasp and hold on to something tightly. What is there to hold on to? Oh, I can hold on to my job description, or I can hold on to the fact that I have this title in the organization, or I can hold on to the fact that that I lead this, right? And so we try to hold on to those types of things. And frankly, a lot of times those are the exact things that we should be probably open-handed with.
Yeah, so Les, you had a good question there. Why don't you go ahead and ask it on mic?
Is this clinging to what was a nostalgia, a false nostalgia? We're hoping that we can keep what we're comfortable with rather than embrace what's coming down the pike.
It can be, yeah. It can be that. It can also just be, I don't know what else to hold on to right now, and so I'm going to hold on to whatever I can. I think in times of stress, Les, I would say 100%. It's us holding on to what we knew. It's that inward focus. I think sometimes in that, in our change curve, if you will, or sort of in the process, we're going to go from some of those fear responses just to comfort responses, just to what seems right in the moment, as opposed to mentally getting to a space of, in order for us to move forward, what are the things that I need? Where should we be focused? What are the questions that we should be asking right now? And frankly, I think that Christ is our anchor, and that we have the body around us. And so how are we paying attention to the relationships in a different way? So all of this, what we're holding on to, is it coming from a place of fear, or I need to hold on to the past and that nostalgia, or is it guiding us into a place of Christ is the anchor, the relationships are sound and solid, and moving us forward? For me, that sort of becomes this linchpin point of, are we focused backwards or are we looking forward?
John, in the last 3 years, with this pandemic that we have been experiencing, the global pandemic, and so many other things that are happening, how does, you mentioned having your anchor in Christ, that is where our anchor is. How does that look different? How does it play out differently for people if we really and truly are assured of where our anchors are, and if they're set right in the right place?
Yeah, I think that, when we start to, well, I'll share a personal example here. So our organization is going through a huge transformation right now, and there's a very real reality that I may not be with that organization in a couple of months. They're just making some huge changes. And in a couple of conversations that I've had with different individuals just over the past couple of days, knowing how differently I look at things than they do in these times of uncertainty, in these times of unknown, there's an anxiety producing sort of thing. And it's not that I'm, happy-go-lucky, everything. But when your anchor is set, I get to ask a different set of questions, rather than saying, well, am I going to be okay, or what's going to happen with my job? I get to say, okay, Lord, what do you have in this season? Well, what's important for me to be paying attention to now, Lord, in this? And so getting to approach it and look at it differently from a place of confidence rather than from a place of anxiety. And I would say as team leaders and as coaches, we want to model a transparency that's not a happy-go-lucky anchoring. It's a I know who has the future. I know who created the future. So I don't have to be scared of it in the same way. It doesn't mean that I have answers, but it means that there's a confidence there that I'm in his hand.
So in the midst of change, you're saying that we should be approaching the changes that come to us because change isn't inevitable. Right? But that we as believers should have a noticeable difference in the way we're approaching that change and the way that people who do not have Christ are approaching it.
Yeah, I do think that, mentally though, it also takes me back to something. It's always fun to have your dad hop on here so you can talk
Hey,
about
Ken.
old sermon illustrations that he used. But one of them that sort of sticks with me is this idea of Paul and Silas in prison together, and where it says, and about midnight they were singing hymns, and this realization that there was probably a time where they may not have been singing hymns, where they needed some time to process us having anxiety or trying to figure out what to do when significant changes are happening. That's normal. Let's normalize some of the anxiety, some of the resistance, in that space. But are we getting to a place of singing hymns in the middle of it, or are we continuing to look around and say, how did I end up here? I'm in prison, or I feel like I'm, bottled up. So I think it's okay to need to process. It's okay for there to be anxiety. It's sort of, as we're moving through that, are we still moving, or just as in a grief cycle, are we circling back and we're never getting out of sort of this place of resistance, this place of fear of the change itself?
Yeah, I often talk to people in GRIP-Birkman terms about I may not be able to control my initial reaction when something happens that I'm not prepared for. My environment is not reacting the way that I think it ought to be. So I can't control that initial reaction. My eyes dilate, I may have a little bit of frown on my face or something like that. I can't control that initial reaction. What I can control is my response to that stimulus that comes, that change in environment. As I then process, okay, yeah, this caught me off guard, but wait a minute, I need to remember, as you say, where my anchors are, that at the end of the day, God is still in charge, and how am I going to respond in a productive, effective way to this, and not just in my distressful stress behavior.
Yeah.
Grace, did you have something else you wanted to add to that? I saw
yeah.
your mic was unmuted and just wanted to be sure.
Oh, sorry, no.
No, that's great. That's great. I thought maybe you had another question.
Uh-huh.
So John, is the speed of change accelerating? And if so, what does that mean?
One of the things I thought that we would eventually get to a point where, post-pandemic, that we would say that things were going to slow down. We used to say pre-pandemic, the rate of change will never be slower than what it is today. And I thought post-pandemic that we would change that. I thought that we would articulate things differently. And there are certain things maybe where it has, maybe the government regulations aren't changing weekly, but I don't see that the rate of change, and certainly not inside our organizations or inside our teams, I'm not seeing that it's decreasing. I'm seeing, at least where I'm observing right now, that it's maintaining that sort of that speed. And I don't, you're going to get some of my biases here. I don't think that that's terrible. I think more where we have to pay attention is how we're responding and what we think will be the fix. And I think that's where this allure of structure comes in. When we think that doing a reorg, when we think that redoing job descriptions, that those become sort of how we need to respond, that's where I see the problem more than actually that change is happening quickly.
So you said in the article, the structure should be a byproduct of evaluation. The structure is not the starting point for evaluation, especially in times of uncertainty. Well, then what is the starting point for the evaluation?
Yeah, I think the starting point for the evaluation is where do we feel the Lord's leading us? I think this is really a discerning direction together sort of opportunity for teams, because the reality of why do we change, master's programs, doctorate programs written about this, right? Why do organizations change? But the environmental factors are a huge component of that the environment around us is going to lead us to change. It doesn't have to dictate how we change or what the end result will be, but our environment is definitely going to impact that. And so when we take the environmental impacts and then we begin to do what we do inside GRIP-Birkman really well, which is let's pay attention to who the Lord brought to understand where the Lord might be leading us. When we take that time to put those factors, the environmental factors, along with who the Lord has brought, when we look at those factors together, then we can begin to understand where we're headed. And once we understand where we're headed, then we can begin to have a more meaningful conversation about what then our strategies will be. And after we've determined the strategies, then we should look at the structure. When we try to do that in reverse order, structure to strategies to people to vision, going backwards, that's where we're really going to get ourselves in trouble. And most people would never say that that's what they're doing. But if we bring the organizational structure into the conversation too early, essentially that's what we're doing. And I'll say this at this point, that for hierarchical structures, for places where there's a very clear power dynamic between them, the default is always going to be to do a reorg with the structure because it makes us feel like we've done something significant. Mm-hmm. And so if you know that your organization or your team is fairly hierarchical, then there's going to be a leaning towards, if we change the structure, we will get a different result. And frankly, you can just look historically, that's not typically the case. That's not typically how it's going to work.
So the other side of that, can you come to the point where it's too late, where we've waited too long to make the changes structurally?
Think so. I think that what typically happens in that environment is that people just feel like they're misfit from the structure, from what they're actually doing, and that disconnect from what I'm functioning with and yet what the structure says I should be doing, that causes so much angst inside of them that they can't handle that. Yeah. I find, though, practically speaking, the more that we focus in on the relationships and the more that we focus in on understanding our own personal 65-35, what's bringing us joy, what's bringing us passion, are we able to live into those things, the less significant the structure conversation becomes. Because I'm not worried about what an org chart says. I'm more worried about the people that I'm serving and getting to love on. And so if you're finding that the org and the job, what's written in my job description, is really dominating a conversation, it could be because we've lost a little bit of our own outward focus. We've come back to a little bit of inward focus of, am I going to be okay?
So let's say that we have a leadership team that really is in the I to we groove, where they really are thinking more we, and their pronoun language has a lot more we language in it. They are aware and looking carefully at what is the combination that the Lord has given them at this moment. They're seeing who are the people, the resources that God has brought together on this particular team or in the organization. So we got a leadership team that really is in the groove with that kind of thinking. How are they going to approach alignment with change differently than what we typically see with what I would call more of the panic mode of let's, move all the chairs around on the Titanic to try and save the ship.
I think the first step that we'll probably see is a lot of open-handedness and probably a lot of as in a transition state, probably a lot of task forces or little project teams where we're beginning to work together differently. I think the more that we're set on, well, this is this team and this is what this group of people, that's what they do. I think we'll begin to see that there's going to be more cross-functional sort of, hey, let's bring this person in for this conversation because they really have this fits their gifting, or let's make sure that we've included someone outside so that we're really getting that perspective as well. So I think that we're going to see a little bit, a lot more of those types of things happening. I think we're going to see some creativity as far as how things are overlapping. There's so much of hierarchy can lead to silos, and I think we'll just see a lot of actions that will break some of those down. The piece that I wouldn't say is that we're not going to see fewer meetings. A lot of people make the assumption that that means that we'll have fewer meetings. I don't think so. I think that's down the road. I think especially as we're beginning and we're piloting and as we're trying different things, it's going to require more meetings because we're going to have to continue to fail fast, be willing to try something and for it to not work and then to move on to the next thing. And there's a freedom in that space that comes as we're trying this. I do think that we get to a point to where we're consistently asking ourselves the 65-35 question, both individually and then in team settings. How are we doing as far as leaning into gifting and areas of passion? And is that how we're investing our time on this team? I was talking with a leader I guess it was just yesterday, and something came up that was in his 35, and I didn't know for sure, but I thought it might be. And I said, so tell me, is that in your 35? And he said, yeah, it is. And I said, would you like for me to take that? Would you like for me to cover that for you? And his initial response was no. And that's just, anytime that we hear that now, he came back later on the day and said, I rethought that. I would love for you to help out in that. But I think those are the sorts of things where we have to be paying attention because I don't know what was necessarily behind that no. Right. And so why is that? And that's sort of how we peel back the onion to figure out what are some of those things culturally that we have on our teams that might do that. Well, was that him wanting to control it? Was that him, wanting to make sure that the wording was right? Was that, there could have been so many things that we could have really unpacked that. But anytime that we're not willing to let go of a 35, I think it's sort of let's talk about it. What is it about that 35 for you that makes it something that needs to still be a 35 for you and you're not letting go of it?
John, you mentioned something there also that I don't think we've given a lot of emphasis to in coach training or in our conversations about the 65-35 applying to the organization, applying to the team. Expand on that a little bit more. People are leaving ministry at a rate that we haven't seen in history right now. And the reason for that is burnout. And what's behind burnout? What's behind burnout is that our 65-35 is out of whack, that we have allowed ourselves to continue. I understand there will be seasons, but we've allowed ourselves to continue in areas where we're not gifted and where we don't have passion for too long. When we do that, that leads to burnout. And so the idea of, what do we need to do to, get rid of burnout? Our culture right now in the West is saying self-care. Cute idea, just doesn't work as far as holistically for an organization. Because if that's the only answer, then that means that my team plays no role
in my own, in how I'm actually thriving. And I think that's, man, that's just not what what we're seeing scripturally, right? That's not what we're seeing as far as how we need to be approaching this. Sure, get some time away, but the reality is if our team environment is constantly draining or fatiguing us, something's wrong. Our team environment should not be draining us. We should be able in our team environment to live into our gifting, live into our passion, which we know joy, power, fruit live in that space. So even though we could be fatigued at the end of the day, if I'm living into my 65, that's a fully different person and presence that I'm bringing to my team, where I'm able to interact in a much more meaningful way than if those numbers are out of whack and I'm doing things constantly that are draining or fatiguing to me. So I think for us to make burnout about self-care, I think we've really missed the core of burnout, which for us is really joy and power and fruit, which is where our gifting and our passion is going to be, not necessarily from us, getting long walks in the forest.
Parallel to that, you mentioned 3 core values of abiding, thriving, and discerning direction together. Could you expand on that just a little bit more about how that then plays into the whole thing of this I to we and health in the team, that then we can approach change differently?
Yeah. I think, again, our culture has driven us to believe that a lot of things are individual when God designed them to be, they designed them to be together. God designed certain things for us to lean in rather than to close the door to our office and figure it out. And so, abiding is one of those. We've made abiding into a personal relationship sort of thing, whereas abiding, even from, scripturally, if you look at, I'm the vine, you are the branches. You look at grapes, a grape doesn't grow by itself, right? So even in the images, the abiding piece of it is a together thing, and we've made it into an individual. In coaches training, we talk about this. Look at our worship songs. How many of them are focused on I rather than on we, right? And so the necessity of us reevaluating and abiding back to a we, so that we're celebrating. I mean, think back to some of those times where we've been together with others when they're, we've gotten away from, in a lot of instances, from sharing of testimonies in churches. But think back to some of those testimonies when we were younger, when someone would stand up and share that the joy that brought, in just hearing from others and how they're abiding, that we lose some of when we make it just about the I. So how do we collectively abide together? The idea of thriving, the idea of us focusing on self-care rather than collective strength. I think this is, the image, if you want the picture to go with this, is, the redwood trees that are huge and massive. Their root systems aren't going super, super deep like we would think. Well, do the soul searching and get your roots really deep. No, they're about 5 or 6 feet down in the ground, and they go out 100 feet and they intertwine with others and they connect and they overlap. And that connection actually gives them the strength. And we've lost that. We've thought that if I pull away, then I can be strong enough to come back, as opposed to learning how to actually connect with others. So that's where that thriving comes in. And then the discerning is, again, me understanding my calling is really important, but that can put me on an island. It can, if I haven't learned how to articulate it, or if I haven't learned how to view my calling in the context of team, then a lot of times it will be sharpened and reformed as I understand how it fits, rather than just having the clear articulation of here's what my calling is. So all 3 of those components truly lay the foundation for teams then being able to move forward together effectively.
So John, do you have in mind an illustration? You don't have to necessarily say where it might be or who it might be, but do you have an illustration where somebody's actually been putting these things to practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of places where people are probably trying to do it and maybe not using this exact language. There are a couple places where they are using this language, where getting started in that, and I think it's it's sort of looking at how are we doing at those at some of these different things, and how are we becoming intentional, right? I mean, we talk about assessments and what's the value of assessments. Well, it gives us a common language to be able to talk about things, and I think that's sort of the benefit of our community and GRIP-Birkman. We've seen that, right? That the common language helps us move forward in some of these areas. I think when we start to look at abiding and thriving and discerning of some of these practices, that common language of, the I value of the personal relationship, or of self-care, or of my personal calling statement, those are all I values that are important. But when we can start moving toward a shared understanding of the we value of loving Jesus together, of collective strength, of discerning direction together, when we can move to the we value language, it helps us. So that being said, where are we seeing it? Well, there are some churches that are working with one right now where they've sort of said, hey, we've got to reestablish some team practices around abiding together. We've got to establish, we've never really had in place the idea of thriving and thriving then together. And so they're establishing some practices around that for them. And frankly, we're not moving forward to the discerning piece until we've addressed those first two. That's then when we'll get to the discerning, which then will, back to the allure of structure, which then will allow us to have the structural conversations for them. They'll do a reorg. They've known that they're going to be doing a reorg probably since February. And it's going to be probably the beginning of the year before we get to the actual org structure component of it. And that feels like a really long time. But to get the abiding and thriving to a place where then we can do the discerning before we get to the org structure component is actually really important and really healthy. It just feels really messy for the team right now, frankly.
All right, because you said the recognition for the need of an organizational change or a restructuring, all those other things that might come into play with that. They might recognize, yes, we're going to have a reorganization, but they don't. You're saying they just don't start with that. They don't start reorganizing without first making sure that the other pieces are in place.
Right, because in the article, I sort of the problem. What can get back to us is it becomes focused then on the job security. It can force us into the hierarchical, well, has the authority to make decisions, or it can, as Les pointed out, put us back in well, I don't want things to change, and the nostalgia of what we're holding on to. Those become more of what people are fighting for to protect, rather than where we're headed in the future.
But the problem with that I see is, meanwhile, if the organization or the structure has not changed, we have people, for example, who are leaving for whatever reasons. And when they leave, we say, wait, let's not replace that person because let's wait and see what the organizational structure might look like later on. Meanwhile, we're continuing to do all these other things. So the rest of you need to take on all those other responsibilities, and have we then just increase their 35 or to reverse it. Now their 65 is not in their strength, and they're only doing about 35 in their strength because they're trying to cover all those gaps. So how do we avoid that?
Yeah, the other word for gaps in this. The other word for gaps in this context would be sacred cows.
Yeah.
And I just want to call that out, because the obligations that we, especially in churches, the obligations that we feel in churches to have certain ministries, to do certain programs, I don't see that in scripture, that's driving why people are gathering.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we get consumed with programmatically maintaining certain things, those are the types of things. So, what's the first step, or what do you do? And it's, what are we going to stop doing? What do we want to lay down based on, if these are the people that are now here, and these are the individuals, and now I understand they're 65-35, I understand where we have areas of passion, what are we going to lay down? And that's a very real question that has to be asked. And part of the reason why you have to ask it is because as you're asking people to experiment and to pilot and to try a new task force and to have some of these additional meetings, if we don't stop doing things, then we're just adding to the workload. And 65-35, if we're pushing people 150% of time wise, it doesn't matter. If we're pushing them beyond their max, then we're automatically going to get less results from them in that. And so it's the conversation of what we're going to stop is a really important one in this process.
So I think that comes back less to a comment or a question you were making about having more meetings and actually trying to, how did you put that about avoiding people adding to their 35 or burnout?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I was thinking about when you're a few moments ago, John, you were talking about this will end up with more meetings. The red flag went off my head. I'm already swamped with meetings. I don't need more meetings. But then as you went on, and my question was, then these more meetings help us avoid the silos being separated, which might produce more of us functioning in our 35s rather than our 65s and then burning out.
I think the other piece of added meetings is this, that are we being intentional about the membership of our meetings? Let's go all the way back to that of in times of uncertainty, what rings true for a team? Well, it's that I want to be at the table for everything, right? Because I don't want a decision made without me being there and having a say in that. And so it leads to these larger meetings, which is where very directly, again, I'll use a real example from last week. I'm with a group that's sort of in this season, and they're establishing some task forces that are outside of their normal hierarchy. And so very directly, I looked at the rest of the group and said, are we committing to adhering to what this task force recommends to us? So that it doesn't have to go to another approval. It doesn't need to go to anyone else. Are we willing to collectively, right here, not knowing what they're going to do in their meeting, to saying that we support them making this decision and we will support the decision that they make? Becoming explicit in that then, and it was an important moment for that task force, because again, it messed with the current processes, the current hierarchy, and it put it down to who are the people that really, I don't want to say should be making that decision, but who are those individuals that are going to make that decision for us right now? And can we be okay with different processes of making decisions? And so I think that's where we have to be aware of, why are people jumping in on certain meetings? Why are people feeling like they need to be a part of it? And from any sort of lead pastor position, it's, where are the meetings that you don't need to be in that you keep getting invited to? Where are the ones where it would benefit the team if you weren't there, and to where then you could just fully empower them to move forward without you?
Wow. John, one last question from me, and there may still be some more from the group out there, but let's try to put this in concise form of, how does GRIP-Birkman coaching apply here? How do we apply what we are learning about this, about the allure of structure, and avoiding being allured into it too soon. How do we apply GRIP-Birkman coaching to that, or how do we apply those principles to our GRIP-Birkman coaching? Either way.
Well, I think in our coaching, in our GRIP-Birkman coaching, a couple of things. One, and we say this a lot, but GRIP-Birkman is not a magic bullet. So it is not the solution for everything. It won't give us all the answers that we need in this. I just like to, make that clear, because a lot of times, well, it seems like GRIP-Birkman could be an answer. It's a tool that we get to use that will help us drive toward questions. If I'm thinking about in this space, what am I really paying attention to as a GRIP-Birkman coach, and what's the skill that's most valuable? It's listening for the direction of the questions and comments that are made. Again, GRIP-Birkman gives us a common language that's, I'll say, comfortable. Hopefully there's some comfort with the GRIP-Birkman language, so that then I can tell, well, what's going to happen to my job, with this. Well, I know that that's probably coming from a place of fear, but I can ask the question, well, tell me more about that question. What's that about for you, right? And I can begin to ask that, and then I can tie it back into the language. Well, it looks like here, one of the needs that might not be met for you is understanding sort of the parameters, understanding that, if I have somebody in the yellow, or, somebody in the blue, it sounds like you feel like you were left out of a conversation where some of this was going on, and that was really hard. Yeah. And so when we can take some of those stress behaviors and say, hey, what's the need that's not being met right now that will allow you to contribute to the process valuably? So I think that that's a really important one as a GRIP-Birkman coach. From a natural side, when we're seeing some of that uncertainty and that angst, that we tie it back into those underlying needs, because ultimately, where do we really want to encourage these individuals in times of uncertainty, in times of change, in times of being allured to structure, is we want to encourage them to lean into their gifting. And so getting back to the GRIP conversation of, what does it look like for you to, outside of your current role, outside of your title right now, how can you use this gift a little bit more? How can you lean into this team style for the church's benefit, or for our organization's benefit right now, in a little bit more meaningful way? What would be a couple of opportunities for that? Bodybuilding roles, if as you look at being a values keeper and equipping releaser, how does that pertain to where we're at right now as an organization or a team? So it's taking those elements and saying, okay, let's get the needs met. So let's get us back to where we can get our diamond to where our diamond should be, so that we can have the dotted diamond conversation, essentially. Let's talk about what it looks like for you to utilize those gifts. The problem is that in times of uncertainty, where we're seeing stress, if people try to lean into their gifts too quickly, we may see more of the liabilities than the actual characteristics of those gifts. So getting to a place of health, meeting those needs then, so that they can lean into their 65 in a meaningful way.
Which brings us back to that thing of abiding and thriving together before we even try to discern where we're going, right?
Yep, very much.
Well, let me ask the group if there are any other questions that you have, or even comments you'd like to make. Want to open up the mics for anybody? Matt, I see your mic's open.
John, you talked earlier on about the speed of change, or the increasing rate of change, but this process seems like one that takes time. How do you approach that with a group that's in transition, and they're looking, to get things done, to get things to a better place, and yet what you're bringing to them is something that they actually maybe need to slow down on? But I don't know, maybe that's too countercultural. Maybe do we need to help them see quick incremental changes? How do we approach that dynamic that seems in conflict with each other?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I do think there's a couple of different pieces that play into that. One, I do think that we have to look at the milestone aspect of it, of how are we making progress, and frankly, highlighting where they've come from in the process and where they are right now, and then continuing to where they're heading. I think that becomes really important. I think the other thing is there's a couple of things that we can do that help us. One is this idea of we have layering of change that happens, and so that's where we get this concept of change fatigue. Back to very practically change management, what's one of the key principles that we need to get better at, as a whole, is ending things well. We need to be able to conclude certain things. So as we have implemented or finished something, really marking it of high five, we've done it, good job. And because mentally that does something to us, we have a greater capacity for more change when we've done that. Specifically in this process, it's that we don't look at an org structure as the end result. I think that's a lot of times, again, it's that allure that we need to have the org chart mapped out and finalized. Why? I understand for certain things it's important so that people know who to con. I get that. But to downplay that and say, rather, how are we getting to where we have effective and efficient teams that are able to do things, that are paying attention to the people that are around them? If we can make that the end result rather than a pretty org chart that everybody understands, then it doesn't force us into this, there's an endpoint with this. It's the way that we're operating stays in a relational context. It stays in a agile, if you will, sort of space to where we can make adjustments a lot quicker, rather than looking for solid anchors that we have to be able to set in the ground. So if we can create that mentality along the way of, we want to be able to adjust with the new people that are coming in. I mean, you're in an international church context, right? The variations of this are going to be ever changing. So rather than making it around individuals and structures, it's, as we have a task force for this season, for the next 3 months, we want these people to get together and really unpack this challenge for us, this problem. Really narrowing that time frame down allows you to lean into it and for people to experiment, which goes back to one of our GRIP principles, which is the idea of we're on a discovery journey together. And so the varied experiences will help us in that discovery journey. Yeah, but a great question.
So, John, it sounds like it might be a little messy for a while.
Relationships are.
Yeah. I'm reminded when I was in college and we had a couple of building programs going on campus, and they went ahead and laid down the sidewalks. But then later on, when the buildings were opened, you could see the little shortcuts that were going through the quad in the grass, and you could see the pathways that were worn down by people taking their own path to get to from building to building. And one of my classmates said, they really ought to build the buildings first and then wait to see where the paths are and pave over those with sidewalks. Instead of putting the structure down and making people try to conform to the structure, they should have let things happen a little bit more naturally. And then we would have had a much cleaner, happier, nicer campus, and people would have only had to walk through the mud for a while instead of all the time when they were taking their shortcuts to the buildings.
Yeah, I think that's sort of it. And we'll find that some places need sidewalks and other places don't. And that's okay. It's okay for certain places to not feel overly structured at times, for them to remain in sort of this, we're going to have this for a little while type of thing. I mean, one of the, even in healthcare, that's super regulated. We talk, one of my favorite phrases is that one of our execs uses is, well, it's temporarily permanent, right? And it's this way today, right? I don't know how long it's going to be that way, but this is how we're operating today. And so to just have that sort of lean into it for today in this way, and if we realize it's that fail fast, it's not working, great, then we'll adjust off of that type of mentality.
Yeah. We hear that a lot of people wanting to know, when are we going to get back to normal? And I said, well, every day is normal. It's normal for today. So let's just, as you say, lean into it. And when we do that, we have a lot less stress, I think, than we are bucking against things that we can't change. And there are things that we can change, and of course, but let's be sure that we're changing them for the right reasons, at the right time, with the right motivations, for the right purposes, so that they will help us to get where we know we're supposed to be going, right?
Yeah, the other piece, Matt, back to that is I think it's okay for us to be countercultural and to say, hey, this is going to take time, and we want to do it well. And I say that more on the front end of us getting the practices of abiding, the practices of thriving, the practices of even relationships, that it's okay for those to take a while. The functions of what we need to do, sure, those are going to feel chaotic, if you will, or we're going to have to figure out how to do some things in the interim, but it's okay for us to slow down in certain areas. And the process as a whole, a lot of times what we'll have to lay out, especially when we have some red diamonds, or maybe not even red diamonds, just people that really want to move things forward, is just ultimately talking about, and again, this is just sort of, how we're going to manage teams, but what's the risk if we go too fast? What's the risk of us rushing through this process? And talking about that side of it, and allowing them to articulate it. So you have two sort of questions that drive this. What's the cost of us not changing at all? And what's the risk of us rushing through it? And so allow them to process those things, which then allows you as the facilitator to guide through in a pretty intentional type of way.
John, I'm going to be in a team build just next week, in fact, and a lot of what we've talked about today I think is going to be applicable in that team build. I've taken a lot of notes, and I'm going to come back and listen to this recording again, I think. Invite you all to do that. Hopefully within about 24 hours it should be live on YouTube, and we'll try to break it up into a couple of pieces at least for the podcast if you're listening to it that way. Thanks, John, for all the insights that you've given us. And folks, we're at the top of the hour again. I don't know about you, but I have really enjoyed this dialogue, and I think we're going to have to revisit it again before too long, John, because the one thing that is constant is change. And I do think that the speed of change is not going to get any slower, as you said. All evidence would point to that it's going to continue to increase, and we have to learn how to be resilient and not resistant to it, so that we can lead healthy teams. And that's what I hope all of you will keep doing as GRIP-Birkman coaches, doing everything you can to help those teams be healthy as they are learning to build unity in the body of Christ, so more people will come to know Jesus. Bye-bye, folks. Thanks again.